The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a warm golden hue over the sprawling vineyard, where our wedding had taken place just hours earlier. It was the kind of picture-perfect setting every girl dreams of: rows of lush grapebeans, twinkling fairy lights strung between the oaks, and the hum of laughter and clinking glasses. I stood at the edge of the dance floor, barefoot now, watching my husband, Daniel, charm a circle of guests with his easy smile and effortless charisma. He was the embodiment of perfection, handsome, successful, and madly in love with me. Or so I thought. The air was fragrant with the scent of blooming lavender and freshly poured champagne. I clutched my bouquet tightly, smiling at well-wishers who passed by, but my gaze kept drifting back to Daniel. He looked so at ease, as though every moment of our whirlwind romance and today's extravagant celebration had been scripted for this precise effect: for us to shine, to be envied. Yet, even in this blissful scene, I felt the faintest twinge of unease, a shadow I couldn't explain. It wasn't a single moment that sparked it, but rather a collection of fleeting impressions. The way Daniel's hand had tightened ever so slightly on my arm earlier when I hesitated during our first dance. The flash of irritation in his eyes when one of the groomsmen jokingly called him a control freak while delivering his toast. And now, the way he threw his head back in laughter, a little too loud, a little too rehearsed. These were small things, easily dismissed, and yet they lingered in my mind like the dissonant note in an otherwise perfect symphony. As the evening wound down, Daniel found me at the edge of the party. His hand slid around my waist, firm and possessive. "Tired, love?" he asked, his voice as smooth as the whiskey in his glass. A little, I admitted, leaning into him despite the unease gnawing at the edges of my happiness. After all, wasn't this what newlyweds were supposed to do? To trust, to surrender to the moment, to believe in the fairy tale? "Let's slip away," he murmured, brushing a kiss against my temple. "Our flight's early tomorrow. I want us to be rested for our honeymoon." I nodded, grateful for the excuse to leave the party behind. The vineyard's cozy guest house awaited us, and the thought of peeling off my wedding dress and sinking into bed sounded heavenly. Yet, as Daniel led me away, his grip on my hand was just a shade too tight, his pace a touch too hurried. The guest house was secluded, tucked behind a grove of oak trees. The thick wooden door creaked as we stepped inside, and Daniel flicked on the light, illuminating the quaint room filled with rustic charm. He closed the door behind us and turned, his gaze locking onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach flutter, not with excitement, but with a flicker of something else, something colder. "Come here," he said softly, extending his hand. I stepped closer, and he pulled me into an embrace. For a moment, the tension melted away, replaced by the familiar warmth of his arms around me. He tilted my chin up to meet his gaze, and his smile was intoxicating. "You have no idea how much I love you, Claire," he whispered. "I love you too," I replied, meaning it with every fiber of my being. And yet, deep down, I couldn't shake the nagging question: why did his declaration sound more like a warning than a promise? That night, as I lay in bed with Daniel's arm draped possessively over me, I couldn't sleep. The stillness of the room amplified my thoughts, and every creak of the old wooden floorboards seemed to whisper the doubts I refused to voice. Was this unease just pre-wedding jitters lingering post-ceremony? Or was it something more, a sign I had missed in my rush to build a life with the man I thought I knew? Somewhere in the darkness, Daniel stirred, his grip tightening for a brief second before relaxing again. I closed my eyes and forced myself to breathe evenly, willing the doubts away. Tomorrow we'd be on a plane to Bali, and everything would feel like a dream again. But in the pit of my stomach, a seed of dread had taken root. Little did I know, this was only the beginning. The morning light filtered through the sheer curtains of our private villa in Bali, casting golden streaks across the silk sheets. I stretched lazily, reveling in the sound of waves crashing against the shore just outside our window. It was idyllic, the kind of paradise that should have erased all lingering doubts from my mind. I turned to look at Daniel, who stood on the balcony, his silhouette outlined against the bright azure sky. "Morning," I called, my voice still heavy with sleep. He turned, flashing me that movie star smile. "Morning, love. I ordered breakfast. It'll be here soon." I smiled back, reassured by the normalcy of his tone. Maybe the unease I'd felt was nothing more than my overthinking. Maybe everything really was as perfect as it seemed. But then I noticed something odd. His phone, usually glued to his hand, was left on the dresser. It buzzed softly with a notification. Daniel didn't even glance at it, a rare occurrence for a man so attuned to every call and email. "Who's messaging you this early?" I teased, slipping out of bed to check. Before I could reach it, Daniel was suddenly behind me, his hand closing around my wrist with startling force. "Don't touch that." I froze, the sharpness in his voice slicing through the air like a knife. He must have realized it too, because he immediately softened his grip, flashing me an apologetic smile. "Sorry," he said, his tone overly casual. "Work stuff. You know how it is." I nodded slowly, But the moment left an impression, one I couldn't shake even as we sat down to the decadent breakfast spread that arrived minutes later. The day unfolded as expected: lazy hours on the beach, couples massages, and sunset cocktails at an exclusive lounge. Daniel was attentive, affectionate even, but I couldn't stop replaying the morning's incident in my mind. That night, as the villa settled into silence, Daniel poured us each a glass of champagne. "To us," he said, raising his flute. "To us," I echoed, forcing a smile. I took a sip, savoring the bubbly sweetness, but as the liquid slid down my throat, an odd sensation followed an acidic burn that didn't belong. My vision blurred for a moment, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. "Daniel," I croaked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Something's wrong." He set his glass down calmly, too calmly, and moved toward me. "It's okay, Claire. Just lie down." Panic surged through me as the room tilted on its axis. I clutched at the edge of the table, trying to keep myself upright. "What? What did you do?" His expression shifted, the mask of concern slipping to reveal something colder, darker. "You always were too curious for your good," he said, almost casually. The words hit me like a freight train. "What are you saying?" I stammered, struggling to focus on his face as my body betrayed me, growing weaker with each passing second. "You weren't supposed to figure it out," he said, crouching beside me as I slid to the floor. His voice was steady, unnervingly devoid of emotion. "But it's okay. This ends tonight." Shock rendered me momentarily mute. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. The man I'd married just days ago, the man I loved, was looking at me as though I were a problem to be solved, a loose end to tie up. "You're going to kill me," I managed to choke out, my voice barely audible. He sighed, almost as if he pitied me. "It's not personal, Claire. You just weren't part of the long-term plan. A shame. You're beautiful and smart, but you ask too many questions." My mind raced, desperate to piece together the hows and whys of this nightmare. But there was no time. My survival instincts kicked in, overriding the fog of confusion and betrayal. I grabbed the champagne bottle from the table, swinging it blindly. It connected with a sickening crack against Daniel's temple. He staggered back, clutching his head, and I didn't wait to see if he recovered. Summoning every ounce of strength left in me, I stumbled toward the villa door. The world outside was a blur of moonlight and shadows as I fled, my heart pounding like a war drum. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to get away. My legs threatened to give out, the effects of whatever he'd slipped into my drink still coursing through me. Behind me, I heard him shout, his voice sharp with fury. "Claire, come back. You're only making this harder on yourself." The sound spurred me on, adrenaline surging as I pushed through the dense foliage surrounding the villa. The terrain was uneven, the ground damp from the ocean mist, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Finally, I burst onto the main road, gasping for air. A car approached, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a beacon. I stumbled into its path, waving my arms frantically. The vehicle screeched to a halt, and the driver, a middle-aged local man, jumped out, alarmed. "Miss, are you okay?" "Help," I rasped, clutching his arm. "Please, help me." Behind me, I heard Daniel's voice growing louder, his footsteps crunching on the gravel. The driver didn't wait for an explanation. He helped me into the car and sped off, leaving Daniel shouting in the rearview mirror. As the villa disappeared behind us, so did the life I thought I knew. The man I had vowed to love and cherish had just tried to kill me, and I was left with nothing but questions and the burning determination to find answers. The small, dimly lit clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic and salt air. The driver who had rescued me, a kind Balinese man named Kedit, insisted on bringing me here after my collapse in his car. I sat on the edge of an examination table, wrapped in a blanket he'd found in his trunk, trembling uncontrollably. My mind raced, replaying the events of the night with horrifying clarity. Daniel tried to kill me. My husband, the man I trusted with my life. The doctor, a serene woman in her late 40s, finished checking my vitals and shined a small flashlight into my eyes. "You're dehydrated," she said in careful English, "and your system is reacting to a mild sedative. You'll recover, but you need rest." I nodded, unable to form words. My throat was dry, my head pounding. Keditut stood nearby, his concern etched in every line of his weathered face. "Do you have someone to call? Family? Friends?" "My family. My friends." The thought of them sent a fresh wave of nausea rolling through me. What would I even say? That my dream wedding had turned into a nightmare? That the man who promised to love me forever had tried to end my life just days into our marriage? "I don't know," I finally whispered. Kedit crouched beside me, his voice gentle. "You're safe now, but you cannot go back to him." The certainty in his words broke through the haze in my mind. He was right. I couldn't go back. But what did that mean? Where could I go? "I need my passport," I said suddenly, the urgency in my voice startling even me. "It's back at the villa. And my phone. Ket had exchanged a glance with the doctor before speaking. Going back now is dangerous. If he knows you're alive. He does, I interrupted. He saw me run. He'll come looking. The doctor's calm expression faltered, and Ketit's jaw tightened. I know someone, Ketit said after a moment. A friend. He can help. 2 hours later, I was sitting in a small, sparsely furnished room in Ketit's cousin's guest house, hidden deep within a bustling part of the city. The walls were thin, the sounds of scooters and chatter from the street below filtering through. It was a far cry from the luxury of the villa, but it felt like a fortress compared to where I'd come from. Ketit's friend, Nyoman, arrived shortly after. He was a wiry man in his 50s with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything. He listened intently as I recounted the events of the past 24 hours, his expression unreadable. This man, Nyoman, finally said, his voice low, he will not stop easily. The words sent a chill down my spine, Nyoman continued. But he made a mistake. You are still here. That means you have a chance to fight back. I don't know how I admitted, my voice breaking. He's smart. He's careful. And he's so convincing. No one will believe me. They will, Nyoman said firmly. But you must be smart too. You need proof. The word lingered in my mind like a beacon. I thought of Daniel's phone, his emails, his obsession with secrecy. If he had gone to such lengths to orchestrate this, there had to be a trail away to expose him for what he was. Claire, Nyoman said, his tone softening. This is not just about surviving. This is about justice. If you run, he will find you. You must make sure he cannot touch you again. Meanwhile, at the villa, Daniel was spinning his web. When I didn't return, he called the resort staff, feigning panic. My wife's missing, he told them, his voice trembling. She wasn't feeling well, and she left to get some air. I think she might have fallen or gotten lost. The staff sprang into action, combing the beach and nearby streets. Daniel played the part of the distraught husband perfectly, his eyes red-rimmed, his voice cracking as he described me in vivid detail. By morning, he was at the police station, filing a missing person report. We had a small disagreement, he admitted, his voice breaking at just the right moment. She ran out, and I haven't seen her since. I'm terrified something's happened to her. His performance was flawless, but he underestimated me. In the guest house, I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching Ketit's old smartphone. Nyoman had used it to set up an anonymous email account and send an encrypted message to my best friend, Jenna. Jenna was the one person I trusted implicitly. She was fiery, loyal, and unafraid to call out nonsense when she saw it. If anyone could help me, it was her. Jenna, I had written, my hands shaking as I typed, I need your help. Daniel isn't who we thought he was. He tried to kill me. I'm safe for now, but I can't come home until I know I'll be protected. Please, I need you to believe me. It wasn't long before my phone pinged with a response. Claire? Tell me where you are. Now. I'm coming to you. Tears streamed down my face as I read her words. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a glimmer of hope. But hope wasn't enough. Nyoman was right, I needed proof. And to get it, I had to go back into the lion's den. That night, as the city bustled around me, I made a decision. I wasn't just going to survive. I was going to fight back. Daniel didn't know it yet, but the game was about to change. The heat of the midday sun beat down on the crowded streets of Bali as I slipped into the internet cafe Nyoman had recommended. The place was modest, with rows of outdated computers and the low hum of ceiling fans struggling against the tropical air. This wasn't my first choice of hideout, but I needed anonymity, and Nyoman assured me this was the safest way to dig into Daniel's secrets. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I stared at the search engine. Where did I even begin? Daniel was a master manipulator, always careful to cover his tracks. But if there was one thing I'd learned from him in our short time together, it was that even the smartest people underestimated the power of their arrogance. I typed his name, Daniel Carter, into the search bar, followed by keywords that sent chills down my spine: fraud, scam, investigation. At first, nothing substantial came up. His social media was polished, full of smiling photos from our wedding and carefully curated posts that screamed perfect life. But then I remembered something he'd once said. Half jokingly, the art of lying is knowing what truths to leave behind. I clicked on the second page of search results, then the third. Finally, something caught my eye: Carter Enterprises offshore dealings under scrutiny. My stomach twisted as I opened the article. It was an old report, buried under layers of PR spin, but it detailed allegations of money laundering tied to Daniel's company. The case had been quietly dropped, likely smothered by his legal team. Could this be why he wanted me gone? Did I know something without realizing it? That night, Jenna arrived. Seeing her step out of the cab in the alley behind the guest house felt like stepping into the light after days in the dark. Her bright red hair was pulled into a messy bun, and her fiery green eyes blazed with concern. She didn't bother with pleasantries. You look like hell, she said, pulling me into a fierce hug. What the actual is going on, Claire? As we sat down in the small room, I told her everything: Daniel's sudden transformation, the drugged champagne, the chase. She listened in stunned silence, her hand gripping mine so tightly it turned white. "Okay," she said when I finished, her voice steel. "We're going to fix this. But first we need proof. And a lawyer. And a way to make sure he never sees daylight again." I hesitated, then told her about the article I'd found. Jenna's eyes narrowed as she processed the information. "If this is connected to his business, there's probably more where that came from. What about his email or phone? You ever see him hide anything?" At the phone. My mind raced back to that morning in the villa when Daniel had snatched it away from me. He'd been hiding something of that. I was certain. "His phone," I said, my voice trembling. "It's the key," Jenna nodded. "Then we get it." The plan took shape over the next 2 days. Neoman helped us secure a burner phone with a voice scrambler, which Jenna used to call Daniel under the guise of a hotel manager. She told him that I'd been spotted near a ferry terminal, stoking the illusion that I was on the run and disoriented. Daniel took the bait. The day he left to chase the false lead, Jenna and I slipped back into the villa. My heart raced as I stepped inside, the scent of Daniel's cologne clinging to the air like a ghost. Everything was eerily untouched: his laptop on the desk, his half-finished glass of scotch on the table. But it was the sight of the broken champagne bottle, still lying where I'd swung it at his head, that made my knees buckle. Jenna studied me. "We don't have time to fall apart," she whispered. "Let's move." We found the phone in the bedside drawer, tucked beneath a stack of receipts and a pocket knife. I unlocked it using the passcode I'd memorized: our wedding date. My hands shook as I scrolled through his emails and messages. What I found was worse than I could have imagined. There were encrypted messages to someone named DH detailing transfers of large sums of money to offshore accounts, photos of passports, not just mine but others, dozens of them, and a chilling to-do list: arrange transport, confirm payment, and dispose of Claire. I dropped the phone, nausea rising like a tidal wave. Jenna picked it up, her face pale. "This bastard wasn't just trying to kill you," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "He's trafficking people. It's monstrous." Neoman, who had stayed outside to watch for Daniel's return, burst through the door. "We need to go. Now." The tension was palpable as we uploaded the files from Daniel's phone to a secure cloud server. Jenna contacted an old college friend, who now worked as a reporter for a major news outlet. Within hours, they were combing through the evidence, promising to blow the lid off Daniel's entire operation. But Daniel wasn't going to let me slip away quietly. That night, while we were holed up in the guest house, a message came through Jenna's phone. It was from an unknown number, but the words were unmistakably his. "You think you're clever, Claire? I'll always find you. Run while you can." The walls seemed to close in around me as I read the message. He was hunting me, and he wasn't alone. "We need to make our move," Jenna said. "Now," Neoman agreed. "The police are reluctant to act without proof," he said. "But this evidence will force them to listen. We just have to get to them first." The following day, we arranged to meet with a high-ranking local officer Neoman trusted. The plan was simple: deliver the evidence, secure police protection, and lay low until Daniel was arrested. But Daniel had other plans. As we made our way to the police station, a black SUV pulled up beside us. The windows were tinted, but the back passenger door swung open, revealing Daniel. He smiled coldly, his eyes locking onto mine. "Get in, Claire," he said, his voice calm but deadly. "Let's end this." Nyman and Jenna stepped in front of me, shielding me from Daniel's gaze. "Back off," Jenna snarled. Daniel's smile faltered, replaced by a dangerous glint. "You think you can protect her? You have no idea what you're dealing with." Before he could make another move, a siren wailed in the distance. The SUV sped off, leaving us shaken but unharmed. It wasn't over, but the tides were turning. For the first time, Daniel was running scared, and I wasn't going to stop until justice caught up with him. The courtroom buzzed with subdued murmurs, the air thick with anticipation. It was a far cry from the tropical streets of Bali where this nightmare had begun. But here, in this sterile arena of justice, I was about to face Daniel for the last time. For weeks, Jenna, Neoman, and I had been working with authorities to dismantle his empire. The evidence we'd uncovered: financial records, encrypted messages, and testimonials from other victims of Daniel's trafficking network had snowballed into an avalanche too big for his lawyers to suppress. But today wasn't just about the legal battle. It was personal. Daniel entered the courtroom flanked by his defense team, his tailored suit immaculate, his expression cold and defiant. He scanned the room, his piercing gaze finally landing on me. I met his eyes, unflinching, and for the first time, I saw something in them I'd never noticed before: fear. The proceedings began with the prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Angela, laying out the case with precision. The charges were severe: attempted murder, fraud, and human trafficking among them. But it was my testimony that would be the linchpin. As I took the stand, the weight of the past weeks bore down on me. I clutched the edges of the wooden podium, my knuckles white, and drew a deep breath. Mrs. Carter, Angela began, her voice steady. Can you describe the events that led to your discovery of Mr. Carter's crimes? I nodded, my voice shaking at first but growing steadier with each word. I recounted everything: the honeymoon, the drugged champagne, the chase through the villa, and the damning evidence we'd uncovered. And when you realized your life was in danger, Angela asked, what did you do? I ran, I said, my voice breaking slightly. I ran because I knew if I stayed, he'd kill me. Daniel's lawyer stood, his expression smug. Objection. Speculation. The judge waved it off. Overruled. Continue, Mrs. Carter. My eyes locked onto Daniel's. I trusted him, I said, my voice steady now. I loved him. And he used that trust to try and destroy me. But what I didn't realize was that I wasn't the only one he was hurting. He's been exploiting and endangering innocent lives for years, all while pretending to be the perfect husband, the perfect businessman. He's a liar and a monster. The room was silent, except for the quiet scribbling of the court stenographer. Daniel's lawyer began his cross-examination, his questions sharp and accusatory. He tried to paint me as a vindictive wife, suggesting my allegations were driven by spite. Mrs. Carter, he said, his voice dripping with disdain, isn't it true that you and my client fought on the night in question? That you ran off in a fit of anger and fabricated this story to get back at him? I stared at him, unflinching. The only thing I regret about that night is not fighting back harder when he tried to kill me. A ripple of reaction swept through the courtroom, and for the first time, Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Angela stood to redirect, her voice firm. Mrs. Carter, did you fabricate the evidence we have presented to the court? No, I said firmly. The emails, the bank records, the witness testimonies, they're all real. Daniel isn't just a liar. He's a criminal. The final moments of the trial came with a dramatic flourish. Angela called her final witness a young woman named Ayu, one of Daniel's trafficking victims. Ayu's testimony was heart-wrenching as she described how she'd been lured by promises of work, only to be sold into a nightmare. She ended her statement with a tearful plea. He doesn't just destroy lives, he takes away hope. Please don't let him do this to anyone else. The weight of her words hung heavy in the room. Even the jurors, who had been stoic throughout the trial, exchanged glances of disgust. When the verdict was read, it felt like the world stopped spinning. On the charges of attempted murder, fraud, and human trafficking, we find the defendant, Daniel Carter, guilty. The gavel struck, and the sound echoed through the room. A sob escaped my lips as Jenna wrapped her arms around me. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. Daniel was being led away in handcuffs when he turned to me, his face a mask of fury. You think you've won? He spat. This isn't over. I stepped forward, meeting his venomous gaze with calm resolve. Oh, it's over, Daniel. And I'm just getting started. As the courtroom doors swung shut behind him, I felt a surge of empowerment. For so long, he'd held all the cards, but now the deck was in my hands. Outside the courthouse, the sunlight was blinding, but it felt like a new beginning. Reporters swarmed, microphones thrust forward, cameras clicking. Jenna shielded me as we pushed through the crowd, but I stopped for a moment, turning to face them. What would you like to say, Mrs. Carter? One reporter called out. I paused, my voice steady and clear. That justice is real, and no matter how powerful or untouchable someone might seem, the truth will always catch up to them. As the cameras captured my words, I knew they weren't just for Daniel. They were for anyone who had ever felt powerless, trapped, or voiceless. This wasn't just my victory. It was a message: you can fight back, and you can win. The weeks following the trial felt surreal, like waking up after a long, suffocating nightmare. I stood at the edge of the cliff in Bali where everything had unraveled, the ocean stretching out before me in endless shades of blue. The air smelled of salt and freedom, and for the first time in months, I felt the weight lifting off my shoulders. Daniel was gone, locked away in a maximum security prison, his empire of lies dismantled. The headlines had spread like wildfire. Billionaire exposed. Daniel Carter's downfall unveiled in stunning courtroom drama. His smug face, once the symbol of charm and success, was now associated with greed, deceit, and cruelty. But my life wasn't defined by his actions anymore. Jenna stood beside me, sipping coconut water and looking out at the horizon. You know, she said, nudging me with her elbow, you could write a book about all this. I mean, my husband tried to kill Maine on our honeymoon. That's a bestseller title if I've ever heard one. I laughed, the sound surprising and light. I think I'll stick to living my life for now. No more looking back. She nodded, a proud smile on her face. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Claire. Not everyone could have done what you did. Her words stirred something inside me. The Claire who had walked into that marriage, starry-eyed and trusting, was gone. In her place was someone who had learned to stand tall, even in the face of betrayal and danger. I had fought for my life, for my dignity, and for the truth, and I had won. A month later, back in New York, I started rebuilding. I sold the penthouse Daniel and I had shared and donated a large portion of my divorce settlement to organizations that supported survivors of trafficking. Ayu and I stayed in touch, and her courage inspired me to do more. Together with Jenna, we began laying the groundwork for a foundation to help women escape abusive relationships and rebuild their lives. One crisp autumn afternoon, I found myself walking through Central Park, a journal tucked under my arm. Writing had become my solace, a way to process everything I had endured. The pages were filled with thoughts, reflections, and dreams of what my future could be. I paused by a quiet lake, the water reflecting the vibrant reds and golds of the changing leaves. A little girl nearby laughed as she tossed breadcrumbs to the ducks, her joy infectious. Watching her, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The scars Daniel had left both visible and invisible would always be a part of me, but they didn't define me. I had survived, and in doing so, I had found a strength I never knew I possessed. That night, I sat by the window of my new apartment, the city lights twinkling like stars. I opened my journal to the last page and wrote, "I am free, I am whole, and I am just getting started." The Claire who once believed in fairy tales was gone, but the woman I had become was so much more: resilient, empowered, unstoppable. As I closed the journal, I smiled, knowing that this was only the beginning of my next chapter. A chapter where I was no longer a victim, but a survivor and a force to be reckoned with.